Hey everyone, ready to dive into atomic habits? We're not just gonna you know, summarize the book today. It's more like we're pulling out those big ideas that really make you think, oh, that's how that works. You know what I mean? Those little light bulb moments from James Clear.
It's true. He goes way deeper than just like make a list of good habits. It's more about the psychology behind them. That's what I think makes it so useful.
Totally. Okay, so have you heard of this thing called the plateau of latent potential? Sounds super complicated, but
It's actually a pretty simple idea once you wrap your head around it.
right. It's like imagine an ice cube. You're heating it up, but it just sits there like nothing's happening. And then suddenly, boom, it hits 32 degrees and starts to melt.
Have you ever had that experience where you're working hard at something, but it feels like you're not getting anywhere? Maybe learning a new skill or trying to get better at something you already do, and then all of a sudden, you have this breakthrough.
It can feel like magic, but we both know it wasn't really overnight. All that work, all those little efforts, they were building up to that moment, right?
It's the plateau of latent potential in action. You don't always see the results right away, especially with habits, but you just gotta keep going, keep casting those votes, as Clear calls it. You hit that tipping point eventually.
And then everyone's like, woo, how'd you do that?
Right. But one of the most important things Clear says is that it's not just about doing the right things, it's about who you believe you are.
Okay, now this is where it gets really interesting. He says, our habits actually shape our identity. And today, our identity shapes our habits. It goes both ways.
Like he gives that example of a person who thinks of himself as a spender. Even if they want to save money, it's hard because their habits don't match up with that goal.
It's like they're always voting for spender with their actions, even if they want to be a saver.
Yeah.
So here's the big question. Do your current habits match up with the person you want to be?
And that's where understanding the habit loop comes in. It's how we actually start to change those votes we're casting every single day.
So the habit loop, right? Clear breaks it down into those 4 stages.
Yeah.
Cue, craving, response, and then reward. It's a cycle that just kind of becomes automatic after you do it enough times.
Picture this. You smell like fresh baked cookies. That's the cue. Suddenly you're craving that warm, gooey cookie. That's the craving. So you take a bite. That's your response to the craving. And then, boom, the reward. That sweet, amazing taste.
And each time you go through that loop, the connection gets stronger. Cue, craving, response, reward, and then back around again. You see why it's so hard to break those bad habits, right?
And why it's so powerful to build good ones. But to do that, you have to understand the pattern. That's how you start hacking it.
And that's where Clear's 4 laws of behavior change come in. 1 for each stage of the loop. Make it obvious, make it attractive, make it easy, and make it satisfying. Do those things, and you're golden.
Let's start with make it obvious. Clear talks about how Japanese train conductors, they use this technique called pointing and calling. Instead of just quietly flipping a switch, they actually point at it and say the action out loud. It helps them stay focused.
That's fascinating. By making the action more deliberate, they make fewer mistakes.
Mm.
I wonder if we could all use a little more of that in our lives.
Exactly. Think about the little cues you can create for yourself. Want to start meditating every morning? Put your meditation cushion right in the middle of the floor where you can't miss it.
Oh, or like, if you want to drink more water, keep a full water bottle right there on your desk. You're way less likely to forget if it's staring you in the face, you know?
It takes away that split-second decision when you're tired or distracted. Okay, next up is make it attractive. This is where dopamine comes in, you know, that feeling of excitement when you're looking forward to something good.
Oh yeah, like the anticipation. So how do we actually make good habits feel more appealing to our brains?
Well, Clear talks about this clever technique called temptation bundling. It's basically pairing something you need to do with something you want to do.
So it's like rewarding yourself for doing the stuff that's not so fun.
Yeah, exactly. Say you love listening to podcasts, but you hate cleaning the house. Bundle them together. Listen to your favorite podcasts while you clean, and suddenly it doesn't feel so bad.
Right. The fun activity makes the boring one way more appealing. I love that. What can you bundle together? Think about it. Is there something you could do to make a have to feel more like a want to?
This is where you can get creative, you know? Make it your own.
All right, let's move on to make it easy. Clear is a big believer in starting small. He calls it the 2-minute rule.
It's all about scaling back your habit until it takes less than 2 minutes to do. Want to run a marathon? Start by just putting on your running shoes. Want to write a book? Just write 1 sentence. That's it.
Seriously, that sounds almost too easy.
It is. But here's the thing. It gets you moving. It builds momentum. Clear tells this funny story about Victor Hugo. To force himself to write, he locked away all his clothes except for this big shawl. No going out meant he had to get his book done.
Wow. I mean, drastic, but effective.
It's a good reminder that sometimes just getting started is the hardest part. Once you take that first step, it's much easier to keep going. And there are lots of little ways to make those first steps easier, like breaking a big habit down into tiny steps, habit shaping, or setting up your environment so the good choices are easier to make.
Oh yeah, like if you want to eat healthier, keeping fresh fruit on the counter and hiding the junk food in the back of the pantry.
Exactly. Make it easy to do the right thing, and you're way more likely to actually do it. Okay, we've made the habit obvious, attractive, and easy. What's next?
Make it satisfying. Our brains love those instant rewards.
Right, and Clear says what is immediately rewarded is repeated. What is immediately punished is avoided. That's powerful.
It really is.
Yeah.
So even if the reward way down the line is huge, like better health or financial freedom or whatever, we need those little dopamine hits along the way to keep us going. Gives this cool example, the paperclip strategy.
Oh yeah, I love that one. It's so simple. Every time you do the habit, you just move a paperclip from one jar to another.
You're basically watching your progress, right?
Mhm.
Even with something kind of boring, seeing those paperclips pile up can actually feel pretty good.
It's a reminder that you don't have to wait for some big reward way down the line. Celebrate the little wins along the way. Okay, so we've got the basics of the habit loop and Clear's 4 laws, but there's another layer to all this.
Oh, I'm listening. Tell me more.
It's all about how our personality influences what kind of habits we tend to gravitate toward.
So it's not just about willpower and strategy,
Mhm.
or individual tendencies play a role too.
Definitely. Clear talks about this really interesting concept called the explore-exploit trade-off.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What's that all about?
It's like, well, imagine you're trying to decide which slot machine to play, right?
Okay, so we're in Vegas, lots of flashing lights, lots of choices.
Exactly. So if you stick with one machine, maybe you win a little bit, but what if there's a huge GE jackpot on a different machine and you miss it?
Ah, I see. So you could be missing out on something better if you don't at least look around.
Right. But then again, if you just keep jumping from machine to machine, you might never spend enough time on one to actually win anything.
So how do we know when to explore and when to exploit?
Well, when you're starting something new, like a new skill or a new job, even a new relationship, exploration is super important. You gotta try things out, figure out what fits, what you enjoy, what you're good at.
So like try all the slot machines at least once, see which one feels lucky.
Sort of. But once you find something that clicks, that's when you shift to exploitation. You focus on that one thing, get really good at it, really hone your skills.
So first explore, then exploit. Makes sense. But what if you don't just stumble upon that perfect game right away?
That's the thing. Not everyone's as lucky as, say, Michael Phelps. He had that perfect combination of natural talent, the right body type, and access to amazing coaching. That's why he was so dominant in swimming.
It's like he hit the jackpot, but he had the perfect machine to begin with. Most of us aren't that lucky.
Right, so what can we do? That's where the idea of creating your own game comes in. Clear gives the example of Scott Adams, the guy who created Dilbert.
Oh, I love Dilbert.
Yeah. So Adams, he wasn't the best artist in the world, and he wasn't the funniest comedian, but he combined those two skills in this really unique way, and boom, Dilbert was born.
He found a way to stand out, to make his own luck.
Exactly. He created a game where he could win, and it's a really powerful lesson. You don't have to be the absolute best at any one thing. It's more about finding a way to use your own unique skills and interests, you know?
That's so encouraging. Okay, so we've got this framework for building good habits, and this idea of finding our own game where we can win. But what about those bad habits, the ones that just seem to stick around no matter what we do?
Ah, yes, the dark side of habits. Breaking bad habits, that's a
Yeah.
whole other challenge.
But Clear has some ideas about that too, right?
I hope he does. Remember those 4 laws of behavior change we talked about?
Yeah.
Well, to break a bad habit, you basically got to do the opposite for the first 3.
So instead of making it obvious, we make it invisible.
You got it. Make it unattractive. And instead of making it easy, make it difficult.
So basically make it unappealing and hard to do. I could see how that would help. Out of sight, out of mind, right?
It's way harder to resist temptation if it's right there in front of you. Think about it. If you're trying to cut back on sugar, having a big bowl of candy on the counter is not going to help.
You're practically begging yourself to fail. So get those temptations out of sight, make them invisible. Okay, that's step 1. What about making it unattractive? How do we actually do that?
Well, every bad habit has some kind of payoff, right? There's a reason we keep doing it, even if we know it's not good for us. It might be stress relief or comfort or just plain boredom.
So we got to figure out what that underlying need is, the thing that's driving the habit.
Exactly. Once you understand the motive, you can start to think about it differently. Instead of focusing on that temporary pleasure or relief, start connecting the habit to its negative consequences.
So like if you're trying to quit smoking, instead of thinking, oh, a cigarette would calm my nerves, you think this is going to damage my lungs, increase my risk of cancer.
Exactly. Shift your focus from the short-term reward to the long-term cost. You make it unattractive. And then the third piece, make it difficult.
Okay, so make it invisible, make it unattractive, and then put some roadblocks up to make it harder to do. Isn't that where willpower comes in? Like, just resist the urge.
Willpower is great, but it can only take you so far. It's much easier to change your environment so the bad habit is harder to do in the first place.
Right, like Victor Hugo locking up his clothes so we couldn't go out. He made it a lot harder to procrastinate.
Exactly. Clear calls these commitment devices. It's basically taking action ahead of time to bind yourself to good behavior, to make it harder to slip up.
Okay, so what are some examples of these commitment devices? Give us some ideas.
Well, if you're trying to eat healthier, you could buy those single-serving packs of snacks instead of the giant family-size bags. To cut back on mindless scrolling, delete those social media apps from your phone, or even ask a friend to change your passwords to your favorite time-wasting website so you can't access them easily.
Wow, that's hardcore. I like it. Make it inconvenient to do the bad habit, and you're less likely to do it.
Increase the friction, make it a pain. Okay, so we've talked about individual habits, good and bad, but Clear also talks about the bigger picture, the system we're operating in.
Oh yeah, that's a good point. He uses this cool example from basketball, right?
Yeah.
The Los Angeles Lakers back in the 80s.
Yep. Their coach, Pat Riley, he introduced this system called the Career Best Effort Program.
What is that all about?
It was all about tracking data, looking for ways to improve, but they didn't just track the big things like how many points they scored or how many games they won. They tracked all these smaller details too, like assists, deflections, all that stuff.
So they were looking at the habits that contribute to those big wins.
Right. And they found that by focusing on those smaller habits, the big results just naturally followed. They ended up winning multiple championships.
That's amazing. It shows that it's not just about individual effort, it's about optimizing the whole system.
Exactly. And it's something we can all do. Look at the big picture. What habits are you tracking? Are they actually moving you towards your goals?
And are you celebrating those successes along the way? Clear talks about how important that is, right?
Yeah.
To make those good habits satisfying and reinforce that positive feedback loop.
Absolutely. Our brains are wired to seek pleasure and avoid pain. So when you make good habits enjoyable and celebrate your progress, you're basically hacking your own biology.
I love that. It's not about being a robot, it's about working with your natural tendencies. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. The habit loop, the 4 laws of behavior change, breaking bad habits, systems thinking.
And don't forget about the explore-exploit trade-off. That's a big one for long-term growth and happiness.
That's right. Finding that balance between trying new things and focusing on what works. Clear uses that slot machine analogy, but he also talks about how it played out in Michael Phelps' life, right? Natural talent, A&D, the perfect environment to develop that talent.
Not all of us are that lucky, but as we talked about, we can create our own game.
Like Scott Adams did with Dilbert. Find your strengths, find the right opportunities, and build a system that works for you.
It's so empowering. It means we're not limited by what we think our weaknesses are. We can all find a way to win. But even with the right habits in place, there are going to be times when we struggle. Clear's honest about that.
He says that even those super successful people, they feel boredom, frustration, they feel like quitting sometimes. The difference is they don't let those feelings control them.
They show up consistently, even when it's not easy or fun.
And they find ways to keep things interesting. Remember those variable rewards? A little bit of surprise can go a long way.
It's like the Goldilocks principle for habit formation. Not too hard, not too easy, just right. And like Goldilocks, you gotta be willing to experiment to find what works for you. It's not about reaching some finish line. It's about continuous growth, becoming the best version of yourself. And Clear reminds us that even small changes over time can lead to some pretty incredible results.
So before we move on, I'm curious, what's one small habit you could start today that would get you closer to your goals? Think about it.
It's a great question to ask yourself. And remember, it doesn't have to be some huge, life-altering thing. Sometimes it's those tiny steps that make the biggest difference.
Exactly. Consistency over intensity. Okay, we've covered a ton in this deep dive, but there's one more piece we got to talk about before we wrap things up.
Accountability. It's a word that gets thrown around a lot, but it's super important when it comes to making those habits stick.
All right, accountability it is. We'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsor. Okay, we're back and ready to tackle this whole accountability thing. I mean, it's a word you hear all the time, but what does it really mean, Especially when we're trying to build better habits.
Well, think of it like this. Accountability is kind of like the extra push you need to actually follow through on those good intentions. It makes the cost of slipping up a little more real.
So it's not just like having someone cheer you on. It's more like, having skin in the game. Real stakes.
Exactly. Clear uses this really interesting analogy. Think about seatbelt laws. Back in the 80s, hardly anyone wore seatbelts, even though, obviously they're safer. But then they made it a law, and suddenly, boom, everyone's buckling up.
Because there was a consequence for not doing it, right? Like a fine, okay, I'm starting to see how this connects to habits. So how do we apply this whole seatbelt law thing to our own goals?
Well, one thing Clear suggests is creating a habit contract. It's basically a written agreement where you lay out your commitment to a specific habit, and then you decide what the consequences are if you don't follow through. But here's the key. You get one or two people involved as your accountability partners.
Oh, so it's like having your own personal referees, making sure you're playing by the rules.
It definitely adds that extra layer of motivation. He tells this great story about an entrepreneur, Brian Harris, who wanted to lose weight. He actually made this contract with his wife and his personal trainer. He had specific targets, and if he missed them, there were consequences.
Okay, spill the tea. What kind of consequences are we talking about?
So if he didn't hit his nutrition goals, he had to pay his trainer, like a serious chunk of change. And if he forgot to weigh himself, even worse, he had to pay an even bigger amount to his wife to use however she wanted. But the best part is, if he skipped his sprint workouts, he had to wear an Alabama hat for a whole quarter of a football game.
Oh my God, that's intense. I mean, if I knew those consequences were hanging over my head, I'd be hitting those goals for sure. But it's not just about the fear of punishment, right? It's also about that social support.
Definitely. Having those accountability partners gives you a built-in support system. Knowing someone else is rooting for you can make a huge difference, especially on those days when you're just not feeling it.
So accountability, it gives us that extra push, and it helps us stay connected to our goals. Okay, but Clear also talks about reflection, which seems a lot more internal, quiet. Why is that so important?
Well, reflection is how we step back and ask ourselves, are these habits actually working? Are they moving me closer to what I want, or am I just spinning my wheels? Clear talks about doing an annual review. Basically, you take some time at the end of the year to look back, see what went well, see what didn't, and then make adjustments for the next year.
Like a performance review, but for your habits.
Exactly. But honestly, reflection shouldn't just be a once-a-year thing. It's way more effective if you make it part of your regular routine. Check in with yourself every week or even every day, depending on the habit. Ask yourself, what went well? What could be better? What got in the way? And how can I deal with that next time?
It's like having that little coaching session with yourself, making those little tweaks along the way. But it's not just about problem solving, right? It's also about celebrating those wins.
Oh, for sure. Acknowledging your progress, that's huge. When you celebrate those small victories, you reinforce that positive feeling you get from the habit. And guess what? That makes you more likely to keep doing it.
It's like giving yourself a high five. And those little celebrations, they add up over time. So I think, as we wrap up this deep dive into atomic habits, the big takeaway is this. Building better habits isn't just about brute forcing it with willpower. It's about building a system, a framework that sets you up for success. What do you think?
Totally agree. Clear gives us these amazing tools for understanding our habits, the good and the bad, and he shows us how to make real lasting change.
It's been so fun exploring these ideas with you, and to everyone listening, we hope you take what we've talked about and actually put it into practice. Start small, be consistent, and remember, you have the power to change your habits, and that means you have the power to change your life, one small step at a time.